Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining. See, we still have a few people coming in and connecting to audio, so I'm going to give it a few seconds here before we get started. Hope everyone's having a nice Wednesday, a good start to their summer. I know it feels like summer here in Southern Oregon, heating up. All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Angie Furman, and I'm the River Training Center Coordinator for River Management Society. And I'd like to welcome you to our June session of our 2024 Wild and Scenic River Training Series, designed to help you all who are engaged with wild and scenic rivers to learn a little bit more, to have some great discussion, and hopefully foster a community of practice. So this is our 6th and final session in the series. However, if you want to go back and catch any of the previous sessions, we have them all available on our YouTube channel, where we've got a Wild and Scenic River playlist. We've got over 45 videos related to wild and scenic rivers on all sorts of topics. So I just put a link into the chat box and you can check out all of our videos there. However, today, in this 6th session, we are looking at when outstandingly remarkable values change, and how such changes might influence management decisions. And this was a topic that kind of sprung out of questions being asked to me. And so hoping that we have some good discussion today around this topic. So as I previously mentioned, we are recording this. I'll also email out a link to the recording to everyone who signed up after this session. A couple other reminders: we've got closed captioning and live transcript available. And I'd love to, I see a lot of familiar names, some new names. So I'd love for everyone to introduce themselves in the chat box, where you're at, maybe what river you're working with or what rivers. And really hoping to have some discussion, like I've mentioned a couple times. So feel free to use that chat box to write comments, ask questions. We'll be keeping an eye on it, and we're gonna have plenty of time at the end today for some questions and answers and more discussion. Also, at that time, we'll probably have some time for you to come off mute, and you can do that. We'll have you raise your hand, and then we'll call on you when it's time for you to come off mute. In the meantime, I'm going to ask that everyone stays muted just to help reduce some feedback. So I'm sure you're all busy typing your introductions into the chat right now, but I'd like to have today's presenters introduce themselves. We've got Steve Chesterton with the Forest Service. We've got Britta Nelson with the Bureau of Land Management, and we've got Matt Peterson from the Forest Service. So I'll have the three of them introduce themselves. Go ahead, Steve.
Thanks, Angie. As Angie said, my name is Steve Chesterton. I work with the U.S. Forest Service. I am the Wild and Scenic Rivers National Program Manager and also serve as one of the Forest Service representatives on the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council. And I'll turn it over to Britta next.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. My name is Britta Nelson. I work for the Bureau of Land Management, and I'm the acting Wild and Scenic Rivers Program Lead. I am also the co-chair of the Interagency Wild and Scenic River Coordinating Council.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matt Peterson. I'm actually on a temporary assignment to the Washington office right now in Develop Recreation, but I'm here today because my day job is on the Willamette National Forest out in Oregon, where I'm the Recreation Program Manager, and that includes wild and scenic rivers. So happy to be here.
Thanks. Excited to have you all here. And so just a little recap of what we're going to be, or not recap, overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're just going to do a quick overview of ORVs. I know we've talked about it in some previous sessions, but just make sure we're all on the same starting grounds. We're going to talk about some agency policies. We're going to talk about adding an ORV or determining that a value is no longer an ORV. We're gonna look at a case study from Elkhorn Creek, Wild and Scenic River, and then we're gonna have some time for Q&A. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over to Steve to get us started.
Thanks, Angie, and welcome everybody. Many of you have probably attended previous webinars, and I'm guessing most of you are not new to Wild and Scenic Rivers. But if you are new and this terminology around ORVs might be a little confusing, I know outside of the Wild and Scenic Rivers context, it has a much different meaning as displayed here, off-road vehicles. But within Wild and Scenic Rivers, it's outstandingly remarkable values. I give bonus points to anybody who can name the artist or song featured in this music video, or either the individuals depicted in the Welcome ORVs sign photo on the right. Answers will be revealed at the end of the webinar. Next slide, please. It is big country. Wow, Nicole, well done. Okay. All right. So we'll come back to that. So outstandingly remarkable values. Well, so I turned to my handy Pocket Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and I flipped to the first page, and there in section 1B, under the Congressional Declaration of Policy, it says, it is hereby declared to be the policy of the United States that which certain selected rivers of the nation, which with their immediate environments possess outstandingly remarkable scenic, recreational, geologic, fish and wildlife, historic, cultural, or other similar values, shall be preserved in free-flowing condition, and that they and their immediate environments shall be protected for the benefit and enjoyment of present and future generations. Along with being a very long sentence, it's a pretty powerful sentence with some unique terminology there. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find outstandingly remarkable used in any other context in American English, at least commonly. If you Google outstandingly remarkable, I'm guessing the top results are going to be Wild and Scenic Rivers related. But that's the term of art that Congress coined under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And straight out of the Act, we have a number of different categories that are highlighted as a key part of that Act and the National Wild and Scenic River System. Next slide. So what does this terminology mean? What does it mean under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act for a value to be outstandingly remarkable? What is that significance? Well, there are a number of different ways that terminology and those values are referenced elsewhere in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. One is right in the next section, section 2B, related to eligibility and determining rivers that are eligible to be included in the system, in this National Wild and Scenic River System, possessing one or more of the values referenced in section 1B, those outstandingly remarkable values. So that's one instance. Eligibility for the system, it has to possess at least one or more, along with being free-flowing. Next slide. Next up in section 3D1 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which was an amendment to the Act later on in 1986 to add language related to preparing comprehensive river management plans. But those plans need to provide for protection of river values. And along with outstanding and remarkable values, those of you who have, again, attended any webinars previously know that when we talk about river values under the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, we're referring collectively not only to outstandingly remarkable values, but also the free-flowing condition and water quality. So this is another area of the Act where reference to river values, including outstandingly remarkable values, is a focal point. Next slide, please. And then we get to section 7A of the Act, which requires any water resources projects or projects that involve federally assisted construction below the ordinary high water mark of a Wild and Scenic River to be evaluated to ensure that there are no direct and adverse effects on the values for such for which such river was established. And so again, those values are collectively river values, including outstandingly remarkable values. Next slide. And the last, but certainly not least, what's considered the Protect and Enhance mandate of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, Section 10A, which calls for each component of the National Wild and Scenic River System to be administered in a manner to protect and enhance the values which caused it to be included in said system, without insofar as it is consistent therewith, limiting other uses that do not substantially interfere with public use and enjoyment of these values. So protecting and enhancing river values, allowing other uses that don't substantially interfere with use and enjoyment of those river values, including outstandingly remarkable values. So outstandingly remarkable values, in addition to free-flowing condition and water quality, that is the focal point of protection enhancement of management of wild and scenic rivers. The difference being with outstanding remarkable values is they are tailored specifically to each wild and scenic river, as we'll get into shortly here, versus free-flowing condition and water quality. That is sort of a consistent value, not sort of, it is a consistent value across all wild and scenic rivers. But with the different categories of outstanding remarkable values, that's where there's differences across each designation. Next slide. So that's in summary what the Wild and Scenic River Act lays out as it relates to outstandingly remarkable values. But how do we determine those values? And there isn't a provision in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act for how to do that. Sometimes legislation that designates a particular wild and scenic river may mention specific outstandingly remarkable values, but often not. Often the legislation is silent on those ORVs. And so then we turn to agency policies and what's also reflected in interagency council technical materials for the approach for determining those values. And what you see on the screen here, it is consistent both for evaluating rivers prior to designation for their eligibility. Again, that free-flowing condition in one or more ORVs that make a river eligible as a candidate for future designation, as well as after designation, when developing that comprehensive river management plan to confirm what the particular ORVs for a given wild and scenic river are. In each case, what agency policies and interagency council technical materials say are that ORVs must be river related and they must be unique, rare, or exemplary within the region of comparison. And these are agency determinations based on professional judgment, but importantly with input from organizations and individuals familiar with the river resources, best available scientific information, consultation with tribes, coordination with state and local governments. It's often a very robust process to inform that professional judgment to determine whether one of those categories of values rises to the level of being outstandingly remarkable. Next slide. So then when we shift to the particular topic of this webinar, which is sort of considering when and if outstanding remarkable values can change, we don't have a lot of guidance to go on in that respect, at least formal agency guidance or even interagency council technical materials. What we do have is, and I'll talk first about Forest Service policy, and then Britta will talk about BLM policy. In the case of the Forest Service, we have some Forest Service planning handbook direction related to eligible rivers. So those rivers that haven't been designated but are being evaluated to determine whether there is one or more ORVs present and they are in free-flowing condition. And I'm referring to that because we don't have particular policy in place related to designated rivers, but in this case, within our planning handbook, we have a policy related to looking at rivers that have previously been looked at for eligibility and determining whether there are any changed circumstances that would alter a previous determination related to an ORV finding. And as you see here, there's direction related to whether previous finding that a particular ORV is not present could change to one where there could be a finding of an ORV present. And some of the examples listed in the Forest Service handbook are the listing of a species. So previously a species was not listed, then it's later listed as threatened or endangered, and is the habitat in a particular river is important for that species. That is included in the criteria for, say a fish or wildlife ORV. That could be considered a changed circumstance that might have an impact on an ORV determination. Also, broad recognition of the river for certain recreational opportunities. Recreational uses change over time. The types of recreational use and how rivers are valued could have an impact on a recreation ORV determination, as well as just more broadly changes that now make a river's values more unique, or again, that overarching framework, unique, rare, or exemplary at the region of comparison. The flip side of that is, whether there are changes where a previous finding that a particular ORV is present on a particular river segment could change to no longer being an ORV, or that ORV is no longer present, and sort of run in parallel to the previous examples. That's of how the Forest Service handbook tracks things. If a previously listed species is recovered, and perhaps upon review that habitat, why a particular river was found to have a fish or wildlife ORV has changed as a result of that species recovery and delisting. Also, events, whether they be catastrophic floods or wildfires or other events that could have an adverse impact on various values, including river recreation opportunities, or again, generally changes that now make the values of the river less unique. We also have a provision in our direction related to commitments made through settlement agreements and administrative appeal decisions that can be taken into account, again, when looking at changed circumstances for eligibility. And with that, I'll turn it over to Britta to talk a little bit about BLM's policy.
Thanks, Steve. So as Steve discussed earlier in the presentation, rivers are found eligible if the river's free-flowing, and with its adjacent land area, the river possesses one or more ORVs. BLM policy provides criteria for each ORV to determine if it is present. And our policy, the BLM policy manual 6400, is specific to wild and scenic river management, and describes eligibility requirements in chapter 3.1E. So when an eligibility evaluation has been completed and documented, additional assessment and study can occur through the land use planning process. A factor for additional evaluation includes changed circumstances. BLM Manual 6400, Chapter 4.1A addresses changed circumstances. And examples of change circumstances include a new ORV or an ORV that is no longer present, as determined through the criteria for ORV eligibility. And an example of a new ORV is a newly listed T&E species associated with the river. An example of an ORV that is no longer present is the finding that the habitat for a listed species is not associated with the river. So discretionary actions could cause a change in circumstances. And discretionary actions that may adversely impact or be inconsistent with identified wild and scenic river values, including the ORVs of eligible rivers, have additional requirements, according to BLM policy. These include at least a 30-day public comment period on the EA, a state director review of documentation supporting the decision record prior to approval of the action, and consideration of an alternative that would delay approval of the proposed action pending a suitability determination through the planning process. If the NEPA document demonstrates the ORVs of the identified river will be protected, projects and activities may be approved without following these additional requirements. Next slide, please. An example of a new ORV is a newly listed T&E species associated with the river. Information regarding the changed circumstance could come from the Fish and Wildlife Service, the public, or through the BLM. Documentation of this changed circumstance forms the basis for subsequent addition as an ORV. But we need to be sure to follow the ORV eligibility criteria in BLM Manual 6400, Chapter 3.1E, to determine the presence of the ORV. An example of an ORV that is no longer present is the finding that the habitat for a listed species is not associated with the river. Information regarding the changed condition, again, may be provided internally within the BLM or through external sources. And documentation of this changed circumstance forms the basis for the subsequent removal of the ORV for the river. It is important to use the ORV criteria that was used to determine the presence of the ORV in determining that the ORV is no longer present. And I think, is this, next slide, please. So back to you, Steve.
Thanks, Britta. So yeah, in summary, there's not a ton of agency policy on these changed circumstances or when and if outstanding remarkable values change. There's not anything in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act that explicitly lays that out. And there's not a lot, if any, case law on this question. And so that leads to, sort of, it's a case-by-case scenario. And a couple of considerations that come to mind, again, that when thinking about change conditions and whether to reevaluate previous outstanding remarkable value determinations are one that, the change circumstance scenarios that Britta and I just went through. Also looking at whether the designating language for the particular Wild and Scenic River mentions specific ORVs. If that's the case, then there certainly would be less flexibility in any changes, at least findings of those ORVs no longer being ORVs. May still have flexibility to add additional ORVs upon further review. But then ultimately, where are you in your planning process? Is this at an eligibility stage? Is this at a designated river stage? If it's at a designated river stage, how far are you through your comprehensive river management plan? Has there been public engagement and consultation processes? Those timing factors are certainly considerations on what approach you might take and what further engagement might be needed before making a potential change in any of your ORVs. And then also thinking about the when that ORV determination was made previously, were factors taken into account adequately, such as indigenous knowledge or climate refugia, climate impacts to particular values. And then there is this other values category of outstanding and remarkable values that doesn't have a defined list. And so that creates, again, when considering in particular adding additional outstanding and remarkable values, provides some flexibility for consideration of what might be considered an other river-related value that wasn't maybe evaluated in the past for being outstandingly remarkable. Next slide. And I believe we're on to our case study. So I'll turn it over to Matt. What do you want to do?
Yeah, thanks, Steve and Britta. So I'm here to talk about a case where we changed, almost changed an ORV, and that was here on the Elkhorn Creek Wild and Scenic River. And so I'll start us off with orienting everyone to where we're talking about and a little bit of the history of this river. So it was designated by Congress, the Elkhorn Creek Wild and Scenic River, in 1996. It was part of a larger omnibus public lands bill. At the same time, it was designated, the Opal Creek Wilderness was designated, as well as the Opal Creek Scenic Recreation Area. Quick trivia fact, it's the only one in the country that is a scenic recreation area designated by Congress. And within the Opal Creek Scenic Recreation Area is the Elkhorn River, Elkhorn Creek. And all of this is southeast of Portland, here in Western Oregon. It's about an hour and a half from Portland. The river is pretty short, honestly. It's about 7 miles long. It's managed by both Forest Service and BLM. Excuse me. And as part of that designation, it was mostly designated wild with a short section as scenic in the remaining part of the BLM land. So this was designated in 1996. For those of you who are deeply immersed in the Wild and Scenic River Act, you know that comprehensive river management planning is supposed to happen pretty quickly. And so we started in 2018. So we took our time. There's definitely a few fits and starts to get there, but as part of the 50th anniversary of the Wild and Scenic River Act in 2018, actually Steve was able to support the local units with some funding, so we could finally start the planning effort as we are required to by Congress in 2018. Next slide. So one of the reasons why we didn't get to or feel the pressure to do the planning before 2018 is that this is actually a really remote and inaccessible river, despite its proximity to the Willamette Valley, which has a lot of Oregon's population, not far from Portland, surrounded by really popular recreation areas. This creek is in a canyon that has, on the Forest Service side, no roads. Within that canyon, there's no trails. There's a road with a bridge that crosses the river near the end of it on the BLM side. But it's a really wild, pristine area, untouched. There hadn't really been any forest management, at least on the federal lands within the river corridor. And so, and honestly, Forest Service folks and BLM folks rarely even went into this area because there was no need to. And so the river was kind of managing itself. It was a great place, great in great condition, and there wasn't pressure from public and from public use or partners to put a plan in place. And so that explains a little bit why it took so long to get there, to get us to planning. And so, and as part of that too, we also had very little data. I mean, we have a lot of mapping remote, but again, we hadn't really done any field work out there to know that the conditions out there, other than the assumption that it was pretty pristine. So we started off the planning effort. Thanks. Yep, go ahead. So we started off the planning effort. Took a little while to get started. And one of the first things we went through is we did a river values report. And so that was working with an interdisciplinary team from both Forest Service and BLM to take a look at what information we knew about this river area and come up with the river values. And through that process, we identified 3 potential ORVs. And so the first one was fisheries. This is home to some endangered species listed fish, Chinook salmon, and steelhead. And it's because of the condition of the watershed, the fisheries folks recommended that as an ORV. The scenery section, or scenery, was also designated or proposed as an ORV in the wild section. Again, because of the pristine nature of the area, even though not many folks went in there to experience it, it was still proposed. And then wildlife was the third ORV that was proposed. It was proposed for the entire length. And earlier there, in the description of ORV is the river-related dependence for ORVs. And in this case, there's the riparian area, because it was so intact, so untouched. The wildlife biologists proposed it as an ORV because of its prime habitat for amphibians and especially for rare mollusks. And that's a mollusk. It's a slug. And there's, an endemic species or a rare species that was assumed to be in this area because of the pristine habitat, the Cascades axetail slug. Next slide. So I don't have a picture of this slug. I Googled, I could only find licensed things and I didn't have permission to use an image. So I'm sharing instead Sluggo. So our local baseball team here in Eugene, level A baseball team, the mascot is Sluggo. And so we got a picture of Sluggo instead. If you're curious what the Cascades axetail slug looks like, you can look it up yourself. Sorry, I can't share a picture of it, but it looks like a slug. And in the river values report, it identified the slug. And you can see here what it said. It's very sensitive to habitat fragmentation, very limited in its ability to disperse, and sensitive to loss of habitat, and it has a very narrow species range. That's the scientific name for the Cascades axetail slug. Not even gonna try to say it. And so that was the driver for wildlife as an ORV. And so we did the river values reports, completed that. We actually, this all happened in 2020, COVID, had to do a virtual, figuring all this out. And as part of the process, we wanted to get public feedback on the river values work. So the IDT had their knowledge and expertise, and we just wanted to make sure that the public was engaged and had a chance to comment. And so near the end of August 2020, we sent out the river values report for public comment. When we sent it out, we did know that a couple miles to the east, there was a small wildfire, a couple 100 acres, wilderness fire, but in deep, thick, old growth woods that doesn't burn. And so we, it wasn't even on the radar when we sent this out for public comment. So next slide. However, come Labor Day 2020, that little wilderness fire, 400 acres going into Labor Day weekend, it really, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it literally exploded overnight. And it was one of 5 fires in Western Oregon that all grew from 1,000 acres or less, or to not even existing, to over 100,000 acres over Labor Day weekend. So it was a pretty amazing event, wind event, that just really caused these wildfires. And in this case, specific to this, the Beachy Creek fire is the one that I'm talking about. It burned all the way through the planting area. You can see the hatched area, that is the river corridor. And it not only burned a lot of acres, it burned really hot. And so within the interim corridor, You can see the stats I put up there: 91% high basal mortality. Not a wildlife or a wildfire person, so I can't really explain to you, but that just means it killed almost everything in there. 98% high and moderate soil burn severity. So not only did it just burn through the corridor, it burned really, really hot through the river corridor. You know, and we had sent out the river values report for comment, but that's as far as we were with the CRMP planning effort. So we're still mid effort. Just so this map real quick, this is the basal mortality map for folks if you're curious. So with the fire, I mean, obviously we had lots of other things to worry about first before this planning effort. You know, but before, if you go ahead, the next slide, it shows the pictures of the fire impacts. The two pictures on the side here, those are a year and a half later. And you can see there's a little bit of green coming back, but it just paint a pretty clear picture of how it just decimated this area and really killed all the trees and burned up all the riparian vegetation in this corridor. So took a while dealing with all the fires, but we got back into the planning effort and realized that we had to pause our process. We finished the public involvement, pause the process, and before continuing with the plan for the comprehensive river management planning, we realized we had to take another look at the work we had already done. And so we reconvened all the specialists, the scientists, and worked. We didn't quite redo the river values process, but we did take another close look at it and produced a change conditions report specific to this planning effort. And through that effort, we took another close look at all of the values, including the proposed ORVs. And so go ahead and go to the next slide. And through those discussions and the conversations we had, the fisheries folks, the scenery management folks still felt that the proposed ORVs were appropriate. Obviously, there was going to be impact to water quality, water temperature that would affect the fish, but it was still going to be a really important area for those ESA listed fish. And on the scenery side, again, the feeling was that fire is the natural process. It was the naturally caused fire, and that a lot of the elements that were identified as having scenic value would still be present along the river corridor, or at least in the wild section. And so those remained as ORVs. Why I'm talking here is because wildlife, the decision was not to keep it as an ORV. And so the wildlife biologists, looking at all of the burn information, the severe impacts to the riparian areas, the knowledge that I shared with this group earlier about how limited that mollusk is in terms of its dispersal, its habitat requirements, the fragmentation. The wildlife biologists decided that we couldn't really propose it as an ORV anymore because of the habitat was just gone. And so there was little to no expectation that it would be able to reestablish itself anytime in the near or even medium term future. And so with the change conditions report proposed dropping wildlife, our leadership agreed with that recommendation. And so since that time, we've proceeded through the comprehensive river management planning, and actually just this January, we went out for scoping and then signed the final decision. And we didn't get any pushback. There was no public comment, no concerns that we heard through the engagement process around dropping that ORV. And so at this point, wildlife is no longer an ORV, and fisheries and scenery are the official ORVs at this point. And so that's our experience. It was, I think in some ways, I'm never going to say that a fire like that is the right timing, but if we were going to have a fire like that to affect ORVs, the timing was fortuitous in allowing us to pivot at that time, because we had not formally designated or formally signed off on any of the ORVs, and we were able to take that step back and look and reevaluate based on the current conditions. And so that's the experience with the Elkhorn Creek. So I will stop there.
I did see a really important question come in. Is Sluggo still the mascot?
Yes, Sluggo is still the mascot. Yes, thankfully. Well, for now, well, I don't need to get into minor league baseball and how we might lose our team and Sluggo might leave, but at least for the next few years, Sluggo is still the mascot and still here in Eugene.
Thanks, Matt. So now we do have some time for questions and discussion. As you're thinking of some questions, I did want to share, and I apologize for now just doing this, but I pulled up the links for the Forest Service change circumstances policy for that handbook, and then as well as for the BLM manual 6400. So just to put these in the chat, just to make sure that they're easy to reference, and then I will also put them in the follow-up email as well. All right. And I'm just reading over Christina's message here in the chat. I'll read it aloud just in case anyone is just joining by audio. But Christina said, mini case study, the Merced Wild and Scenic River was designated in 1987, but the plan wasn't initiated until 1999 under a court order. At that time, the National Park Service revised the ORVs. When Yosemite's completed comprehensive river management plan for the Merced Wild and Scenic River in Yosemite was being litigated in the early 2000s, the change of ORVs was challenged in court because the National Park Service was able to point to the, at the time, new interagency Wild and Scenic River guidance criteria for ORVs. Thanks, Cassie Thomas and Jackie Dietrich. The court upheld the Park Service's ORV revision. As a result of this decision, the ORVs for the Tuolumne Wild and Scenic River in Yosemite, which was designated in 1984, were also revisited and revised throughout the NEPA planning process for the NPS CRMP, including the creation of ORV baseline/changed conditions report, and no further legal challenges. Yay. So thanks for sharing that, Christina. And if you had anything to add to that, Christina, you're welcome to share. I did see a question come in asking, what was the basis for each of the ORV revisions? Was it the ORV guidance criteria, or was it the climate change effects, etc.? Oh, sorry, Jen. And Christina, if you're there, you're welcome to just come off chat and answer that if that's easier for you. Or come off mute. Oh. All right, we'll work on getting Christina off mute here.
Oh wait, there we are. Yay.
All right.
Sorry about that. So in answer to the question, the main basis for the change in the revisions, I think when the ORVs were first created for the Merced in 1987 and then the Tuolumne in 1984, the ORVs were kind of what's cool in the water, what's cool in the river corridor. There wasn't really a huge basis for what the ORVs were back in those early days. And the Interagency Wild and Scenic Rivers Coordinating Council came out with a white paper that really created criteria, which is an ORV. To be considered an ORV, it has to be rare, unique, and exemplary in a regional and national context. And that was something that was able to really help guide the Park Service's decision to revise those ORVs. So it really became a process of taking a new look at what had been originally proposed, running it through that filter, and essentially just fine tuning. And in some cases, some ORVs had actually dropped off. But the court actually found that because we were able to point to the Interagency Coordinating Council's guidance, that constituted reason enough, and because it was an interagency process to determine that criteria, that there was deference to the government in this case. So hooray.
Thanks, Christina.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Christina. I wasn't actually aware of that aspect of the litigation involving Merced. What was curious, was that a challenge to the plan or a particular project or activity proposed on the Wild and Scenic River? Do you have a recall?
Well, it started as a challenge to a project in the park as a result of there was a 100-year flood that took place in 1997 that wiped out a bunch of infrastructure, and the park, instead of wanting to just put everything back, really wanted to take a look at what was important with the river. Although there was a defunct historic dam on the Merced River that the park wanted to remove, and so there was a legal challenge to, believe it or not, from the Sierra Club to not take the dam out because the CRMP had not been completed. So that dam removal project was halted until the park was able to complete its CRMP. Once the CRMP was completed, then those same litigants essentially came back and sued the plan. So, and then thus there was about a decade of back and forth litigation on the Merced Wild and Scenic River Comprehensive Management Plan, which was finally, I believe, finalized in 2014.
Thanks for that history. That's really valuable.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Thanks for letting me put you on the spot too. Let's see, another question I saw come through in the chat, but asked, ORVs are to be protected for generations to come by law. Delisting an ORV means failure, doesn't it? And maybe while someone's thinking of an answer, I was thinking about this and thinking back to one of the examples shared earlier of, like, for example, the delisting of a species as threatened or endangered. You know, that does not necessarily mean failure as far as management if we're increasing their I guess bettering their habitat and their overall species, but not sure if anyone else has any ideas around that they'd like to share.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, you know, as I pointed to in going over the provisions of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, you know, there's reference to, you know, protecting and enhancing river values, you know, and specific categories of outstanding remarkable values. But in a lot of cases, those specific ORVs aren't defined in legislation, and it's up to agencies with input from the public to determine those ORVs. And, you know, we don't really have a script for, you know, can those ORVs change or not, you know, once they've been identified. And so, yeah, and it goes in both directions. Like, it could be an enhancement of those conditions that might lead to rethinking of whether that value continues to be unique, rare, and exemplary for a particular species, let's say, or yeah, there could be an impact on conditions in the other direction. But, you know, I think it's an open question, you know, especially when we think about impacts related to a warming climate, you know, and how to adapt and incorporate resilience into our approaches to wild and scenic rivers management. You know, what role do ORVs and reevaluation of particular ORVs as it relates to their conditions, and then the resources that go then towards managing those as the focal point of a particular river. You know, is that something that evolves over time, or is it something that's static in perpetuity that we're trying to manage to a particular desired condition, no matter what might change otherwise? So I certainly don't have the answers to all those questions, but yeah, interested in thoughts from folks on the webinar today.
And then I see Tony, your hand's up. Let's go to Tony, and then we'll go to some of the other questions in the chat.
I was, pardon me, I was gonna postulate Bud's question there. I think with my non-specialist understanding of drafting ORVs, it would be incumbent when the ORVs are being written to tactfully describe the ORV in the case of like threatened and endangered species, for example, that the value is in the habitat itself. If you craft the ORV around the rareness or endangeredness of the biota, that may not, I can see where Bud might be coming from in like a logic kind of way. But if the ORV is based on the quality and abundance of the habitat that the species needs, then delisting or downlisting a species, for example, might be an indicator of changing conditions that still perpetuate the ORV because the habitat is improved. There's like biologically a pretty statistically significant difference between habitat and its potential use and species richness and abundance. And so I think drafting the ORV, especially around like planning ahead for what are likely, you know, anticipating what changes may happen when you write out the ORVs, and making sure that you're not painting yourself into a corner where, you want to improve, restore, and repopulate endangered species, for example. But if the ORV is a habitat, anyway, so
Thanks, Tony. And yeah, it's something that I've heard you mention, and also heard Steve mention, is just this idea of like where you're at in the planning process too. As I was preparing for this presentation and trying to find different examples out there and seeing, you know, where people are in their planning process, similar to like the Elkhorn had just sent out for public comment, river values. It's I think that can change a lot of things as far as the direction that you're going to head. And also, just a small plug for one of the first webinars we did in the series on the importance of river value descriptions and them being detailed and thorough. So if you weren't able to join us for that one, I encourage you to check that out because totally applies to these. Go ahead, Nicole. No, I mean, Jen. Sorry.
It's actually Jen Reed here, but I'm sorry I had my video on for a long time. I did not realize it was on. That's embarrassing. So anyways, I guess probably because it's showing on Nicole's screen, not mine. Anyways, I think what we're dancing around is the notion that you want to make sure that you can actually manage what you're identifying as an ORV. You know, if you have no feasible ability to take management actions that would preserve that ORV, that puts you in a pretty complex situation besides education and awareness. So I kind of heard Mr. Mancuso struggling with that a little bit, and I'm kind of hearing Angie talk around the edges of that. So I'm kind of curious what people think of that.
So it's a interesting point, Jen. But I think you also need to be careful about, at least you know, in the study process, pre-designation, right? Eligibility, that those determination of ORVs is an inventory process, you know, based on the ORV criteria. Suitability, in the next step in the study process, looks at sort of management challenges and other factors about whether a river should be found suitable and recommended for designation. And so, you know, I think, you know, when we talk about designated rivers, I'd recommend that you still think about the ORV criteria. But I think there also is a management component there when you're considering whether to go back and relook at ORVs and say, you know, you are sort of thinking through, there have been some changed circumstances. Maybe there is a strong likelihood that an ORV previously found no longer rises to the level of being an ORV. You know, why would you want to go back and look at it to evaluate whether it still meets that criteria or not? And I think the why could then be related to management considerations and how to allocate limited resources, as I think most folks managing wild and scenic rivers don't have unlimited resources. And so since the ORVs are that focal point of a particular management plan and where you're dedicating your resources to protect and enhance, you know, if there's a change in ORVs and maybe then therefore a change in resources, a change in emphasis, you know, there could be a management connection back to sort of why you might want to, you know, review previous ORV determinations, but it's sort of separated out from the ORV evaluation itself, which I would say is still looking at whether a particular ORV rises to the level of, whether a particular river value rises to the level of being unique, rare, and exemplary in its region of comparison. So hopefully that made some sense and wasn't too nuanced, but that's one person's opinion.
Well, maybe if I could, you know, like speaking from the Elkhorn experience, I think there's also the different, a lot of it in my mind, or at least as I'm seeing this conversation, like what's the cause of the delisting or the D of an ORV, you know, in our case, and this is also a, you know, answering one of the questions in the chat too. It was a completely natural wildfire. It was a lightning started wildfire in the wilderness, and because of the dangers there, they couldn't put firefighters on it. They tried to fight it, as you know, it wasn't a let burn fire, but there was also for wildfires, for firefighter safety, couldn't go direct. And then it was a wind event that made it burn through. And so while fires of this scale and scope are unusual in Western Oregon, they're not, you know, there's a historical record of them happening. And so in that sense, it was a fully natural event that occurred and caused the loss of habitat for the mollusk in this case, and which is why we delisted it. And so, you know, I guess I just put that out there as like, I wouldn't say that's a failure of the agency and or anything like that. I think, you know, it gets to one of the Steve's comments earlier about how static are these landscapes or not, and you know, and how do ORVs come into play through the natural variation and variability of our landscapes that they've been doing over millennia. So.
All right, I see we've got some other questions in the chat, and this one I'm going to ask you, Matt, around what caused the Beachy Creek fire. Did the Beachy Creek fire, which affected Elkhorn Creek, influence any changes to Forest Service or BLM wildfire management policy? Were any changes made to access as a result of the fire? Other than delisting the wildlife ORV, I guess I wouldn't call it delisting because it wasn't officially an ORV, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how did the fire influenced the final CRMP?
Yeah, so yep, so that first part of the question, how it started, it was like I said, it was a lightning start in the wilderness. And I'll be honest, I'm gonna punt the question on changes to wildfire management policy. That's definitely above my pay grade, outside my lane. So yeah, so I don't feel comfortable answering that one. Now, in terms of the other questions, any changes to access? No, we didn't go in and do any roads, trails. It's still in the same condition access wise, although now a lot even harder than it was before because of all the dead trees that have, had a few years to fall and crisscross and jackstraw. But no, no built access where changes occurred to the area. And then other than changing the ORV, how did the fire influence the final CRMP? That is a good question. It definitely slowed it down, but that's probably not really what you were getting at. I don't know that it changed it a lot in terms of the fun, other than the wildlife ORV and its final result. Again, one of the really unique things of this corridor was how untouched and pristine it was pre-fire, and we expect it to remain that way. And so we did talk about it through the CRMP process and coming up with some of the elements of like what we might do in the future. Is that especially in the wild section, we talked about how this really could almost be a reference landscape for fire recovery because of the lack of management that had occurred pre-fire. It's not like there was old clear cuts or timber management activities that burned through. It was a natural fire and a natural landscape. And so in that sense, we talked about the importance of not really doing much to very little to nothing in the wild area to allow it to have that reference landscape benefit, both from the river perspective, but the landscape itself. And so that's the only thing that comes to mind. My partner in crime from the BLM is on this, Kara Hand is on here too. So if she has anything to add, she can type it in the chat if there's something I'm missing. But yeah, I think that's all I can think of.
Thanks, Matt. So I see a message from Hattie asking some advice, saying the local citizens group has some interest in expanding ORVs in a designation beyond what was defined in the Forest Service eligibility study. The group is working on research into some aquatic habitat values. We're working with our local Forest Service on this, but could use some advice on how to best move forward with potentially changing or adding ORVs for the crystal. Anyone has any advice? And I'll open it up to anyone. So.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Hattie. I think the work with the local Forest Service office is key there, because at least under Forest Service policy, the reevaluation of previously evaluated rivers for their eligibility, that's at the discretion of the responsible official or local line officer within the Forest Service. So I think just communicating the intent and the information and the research that your group is looking at, and having that open line of communication with Forest Service staff would be my advice.
Thanks, Steve. And then Britta, I see that you answered it in the chat, but I want to give you an opportunity to just reiterate or expand if you'd like. Kara had asked about, did I hear you correctly that changing an ORV can be done during the land use planning process, or were you saying it can be done through an EA?
Yeah, I want to apologize for the background noise. I am on the road, and I am concerned that my laptop's gonna lose power, so I'll answer really quick. I do apologize, Angie and Steve and Matt and the group. So the land use planning process and NEPA is what we would go through to evaluate the change circumstance. It's not that we would use that to just change an ORV. We would want to evaluate if it's present or not, and go through the NEPA and planning process to document that and go through the public process. It's not to just change the ORV, it's in response to the change circumstance. Does that answer the question?
I'm sorry, I lost my voice, but yes, thank you.
Thanks, Britta. And
Yeah.
yeah, and then also I see Christina just posted a link in the chat to the interagency technical paper on the study process. I'm not sure that that link came through, so I can repost that there. Or if you go to rivers.gov, you can find it there. Here we go. I'm just gonna try to copy and paste part of that. There we go. So thanks, Christina. She pointed out that there's some guidance on pages 12 through 15 that you might find particularly useful. Do we have any other questions? Or examples that people know of, you know, as we were working on this, I was trying to just reach out and find other examples where people have considered this, whether they've gone through with adding or changing an ORV in some way. So would love to know more examples, or you're welcome to email them to me afterwards as we continue to build our knowledge around this. So. All right. You're gonna have like another minute to think of questions. In the meantime, though, I just want to thank everyone. I feel like it's been like alphabet soup today, you know, like ORVs, CRMPs. I know it's a lot of acronyms. So thanks for bearing with us on Wednesday in a nice, probably nice summer day. Again, I will be sending this out as well as some of these links that have been shared in the chat. I'll also include a link to the slideshow in case you want to check out those slides afterwards. Any last questions or final thoughts?
Just as promised, and give people more time to potentially chime in, to go back to my ORV trivia. Yes, Jen Reed, acting as Nicole Gustine on Zoom today, got the music video answer correct. It is Big Country with their hit In a Big Country, featured in that clip. And then the photo was of Joan Harn and Jim McCartney. Joan retired Park Service, and Jim current Park Service, and both were, and Jim still is, an interagency council member. So there you have it.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. Super important. We can't.
Yes.
And also, when you're leaving the meeting today, it's going to forward you to a survey. Would love to hear your thoughts on the survey. Also, as I'm starting to think about next year's Wild and Scenic series, would love to hear any thoughts. You're welcome to share them in the survey anonymously, or you can email me any topics that you might be interested in knowing more about. So thank you all who've joined throughout the whole series. And big thanks again to Steve and Britta and Matt for coming and sharing with us today. So no more questions. I'll give you back some of your time and hope you all have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, Angie. Thanks all. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.